Hey, you. What is the worst thing you've ever done when you're angry? You don't actually need to tell me, just think about it for a moment. It's safe to say that if you're an adult watching this video, then at least once in your life, you've been absolutely disillusioned with anger. You've probably responded emotionally in ways that you would later regret. Perhaps you've overreacted. I'm guilty of this many times over. I've even had to attend anger management against my will, but that is another story. My point is, this is far from a unique experience. You could say that rage is inherent to the human condition. Let's try another question. How much of your anger would you say could be attributed to societal or systemic factors? How often do the failures of our elected officials, our government, our society leave you just blinded with frustration? Okay, last question. I assume that you've been speaking your answers out loud, sharing your own personal anecdotes directly into your phone or computer monitor. Please continue doing so. If you are persistent, then I will hear your words. Or you can just leave a comment, I suppose. So one last question. In your moments of rage, anger, frustration, and disillusionment, how many people have you killed? Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman and Decorated General Mark Milley spoke before the House of Representatives recently. He was addressing the House Armed Services Committee, responding to questions from Republican Representatives Matt Gaetz and Michael Waltz, who had previously been interrogating Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. Now, heated discussions between Republican windbags and old military brass are nothing new. But this particular exchange made the headlines, and it made the white men who peddle fear and uncertainty for a living much, much more afraid and uncertain. And they didn't hesitate to voice their concerns.
We need new leadership. Anyone who seeks to purge patriotic volunteers from our military based on changing political whims, and anyone who spends more time thinking about January 6th than China, shouldn't be leading our troops.
Principles of open inquiry at the heart of Western civilization and progress in favor of the kind of ideological indoctrination seen in medieval Europe or Chairman Mao's Cultural Revolution in China.
Leveling a race attack against American citizens. The guy is supposed to be protecting our country. That is disgraceful. It's disqualifying. It's without precedent. When was the last time that happened?
Given if you thought General Mark Milley's aim in senior leadership was to break his own army. His record in office, first as Army Chief of Staff and now as Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is a dismal roll call of failures.
Sounds about white. Seriously, though, that's a whole lot of energy being spent to push back against 2 minutes worth of fairly milquetoast comments. So let's see the clip of General Milley, unedited, in full context, and figure out what has all of the right wing punching their wives and kicking their dogs out of pure, unrestrained rage.
Sure. First of all, on the issue of critical race theory, et cetera, I'll obviously have to get much smarter on whatever the theory is. But I do think it's important, actually, for those of us in uniform to be open-minded and be widely read. And the United States Military Academy is a university. And it is important that we train and we understand, and I want to understand white rage, and I'm white, and I want to understand it. So what is it that caused thousands of people to assault this building and try to overturn the Constitution of the United States of America? What caused that? I want to find that out. I want to maintain an open mind here, and I do want to analyze it. It's important that we understand that because our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Guardians, they come from the American people. So it is important that the leaders, now and in the future, do understand it. I've read Mao Zedong. I've read Karl Marx. I've read Lenin. That doesn't make me a communist. So what is wrong with understanding, having some situational understanding about the country for which we are here to defend? And I personally find it offensive that we are accusing the United States military, our general officers, our commissioned, non-commissioned officers, of being, quote, woke or something else because we're studying some theories that are out there. That was started at Harvard Law School years ago, and it proposed that there were laws in the United States, antebellum laws prior to the Civil War, that led to a power differential with African Americans that were 3/4 of a human being when this country was formed. And then we had a Civil War and Emancipation Proclamation to change it. And we brought it up to the Civil Rights Act in 1964. It took another 100 years to change that. So look it, I do want to know. And I respect your service, and you and I are both Green Berets. But I want to know. And it matters to our military and the discipline and cohesion of this military. And I thank you for the opportunity to make a comment on that.
Really? That's what everyone is up in arms about? This is the brutal speech that made Matt Gaetz look like he needed to go cry in the bathroom after the hearing? Apparently, this was all a response to the right wing's latest boogeyman, critical race theory. Last fall, conversations were coming up again about maybe, possibly, perhaps talking about the state of race relations in the United States from a legal and socioeconomic perspective, taking into account material analysis and historical context. I didn't actually want to delve into this subject because honestly, I think that our energy as based Hotep anarchists should be focused elsewhere. But there seems to be a fair amount of confusion, so I'd like to add a millennial black voice to the conversation and perhaps cut through some of the propaganda and fear-mongering and misinformation. What is CRT? Critical race theory, or heretofore referred to as CRT, is an academic movement in the United States. It was founded by a number of scholars and civil rights activists. The goal is to take a critical look at the legal framework of the United States and how it interacts and intersects with race relations. Traditionally, there has been a fairly liberal approach to the concept of racial justice, and this has been largely ineffective when it comes to addressing the issues affecting marginalized and oppressed races in the U.S. Critical theory is not a new concept. It was first defined by Max Horkheimer in 1937. In his essay, he wanted to push a social theory that would examine, critique, and ultimately change society as a whole. Prior to this point, theory generally only worked to understand or explain society. You may hear some of the modern-day talking heads scaremonger about how this is related to Marxism, and they aren't entirely wrong. Horkheimer based his critical theory off of the context of critique as utilized by Immanuel Kant and Karl Marx's critique of political economies in his work Das Kapital. Generally, in the realm of sociology and political philosophy, critical theory does refer to a Western Marxist philosophy often credited to the Frankfurt School. I'm not going to delve too far into the history of the Frankfurt School and all of the long-dead German dudes associated with it, but just know that people like Gramsci, Marx, Freud, and Habermas were all part of it at one point or another and have impacted academic sociology for almost a century. So don't let anyone tell you that this is some new scheme by postmodern neo-Marxists or whatever. Critical theory isn't new. Conservatives who don't read and don't know history aren't new either. Critical race theory originated in the 1970s, and it takes the aforementioned approach to examining society from a legal and sociological perspective, with the exception being that it incorporates the philosophy and research of more melanated great thinkers like Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, as well as numerous civil rights movements throughout history. As with any theory, academia is far from a monolith. CRT theorists don't all agree on their interpretation of the data, and they don't all share the same lens through which they view society. That said, there are some basic core tenets. These include acknowledgement of the concept of racism, disparate social and racial outcomes, and how both of these are influenced due to sometimes imperceptible social and institutional dynamics. This is in contrast to previously assumed notions of explicit and intentional prejudices on the parts of individuals. This is important for any of you parents out there worried that your lily-white children are being told that they are dirty, dirty racists. This theory focuses on the institutions and social dynamics, not individuals. Very important. The impetus behind this CRT was due in part to the aftermath of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, specifically the erosion of the hard-fought victories of the movement of the previous decade and the stalling of further progress. In the 1980s, students of color at Harvard Law School began organizing protests against Harvard's lack of racial diversity among the faculty and students, as well as the lack of diversity in the curriculum. A law professor named Derek Bell, who left Harvard, would go on to develop new courses that would study American law through a racial lens. The students requested that the school incorporate these new courses into the curriculum and hire faculty of color to teach the curriculum in his absence. Harvard stated that there was no sufficiently qualified black instructor in existence, which was a lie. They proceeded to hire a basic white-bread liberal. So the students took it upon themselves to meet and educate themselves on the concepts of critical race theory. It would grow in popularity throughout the 80s and 90s. Now, I'm not really a theory deep dive type, but I will link some resources in the description for further reading. So you might be wondering, how did the public and the government respond to this growing academic movement? Perhaps the institutions in power welcomed these new and enlightening concepts, offering real and tangible solutions to some of the issues of race relations affecting the country, right? Right? Oh wait, CRT acknowledges white supremacy? Uh-oh. Because there's nothing new under the sun, and history is a flat circle, ever since the 80s, every time critical race theory has been brought up, you can count on the same political party that advocates for child brides to come out in loud, obnoxious opposition to CRT. In the 90s, Republicans in Congress lambasted Lani Guinier, Bill Clinton's nominee for Assistant Attorney General, for her history working with CRT, and ultimately Clinton withdrew his nomination. In the 2010s, a school district in Tucson, Arizona made the news when they banned a Mexican-American studies program that was derived in small part from CRT. This led to the school literally confiscating books from students while they were in class, all for the crime of advocating for ethnic solidarity instead of individualism. A federal judge would go on to find the state acting from a place of discrimination and would overturn the ban. In the last dying breaths of the 46th president 4-year failure spiral, he went on a mad crusade, banning any educational or training texts in any federal agency that mentioned white privilege or critical race theory. As is typical, the Republican governors and senators all fell in line and began pushing hard legislative bans on any sort of CRT or CRT-derived curriculums in public schools or government agencies, despite the fact that this wasn't a widely accepted field of study outside of academic law and sociology settings. In general, a bunch of scared white men did what they always do when faced with the opportunity to learn something. They circled their wagons and are now fighting tooth and nail to preserve their ignorance and, of course, their power and influence. Scary buzzwords and fear-mongering about CRT isn't even restricted to the United States anymore. The UK, Canada, and Australia, all places that live in the shadow of colonialism, have had extreme reactions to the concept of critical race theory, and black and indigenous scholars and activists have been trying to push back. Here's the thing, though. None of the conservatives' arguments are true. All of the conservatives in my country that are pushing these hard bans against CRT are pushing a lie. They get on the news and on the radio and on Twitter, and they address their constituency of people who are tired, frustrated, and uncertain coming out of a deadly pandemic and a severe economic downturn. And they tell them that their children's teachers are accusing them of having white privilege, calling them oppressors, and calling them racists. They go on to say that black students are being told that they are victims and that they are perpetually oppressed. None of this is true. This isn't happening. Sure, you can probably find some anecdotes of a teacher here or there doing something stupid and tone deaf, but overwhelmingly, the only curriculums that take anything from critical race theory outside of college-level courses or on-the-job training for adults is basic material analysis of history with regards to the effects that it had on the black community. Something I might add that wasn't really present in the public school curriculums up until a few years ago. Black history in general wasn't even a thing in school for a long time. But there are no radical Marxist teachings being forced upon your pure white children. Your pasty mayo spawn are not being indoctrinated, and black children are not being conditioned to be victims. But I can tell you why conservatives really want you to be scared of all this. Because if you get a generation with a knowledge of the actual history of the United States and how that history has led to the present-day social conditions for people of color in America, then you'd have a generation who might be motivated to do something about it. And we know they can't have that. The very prospect of that makes them very, very angry. Oh, hey, there's that white rage we spoke of. Now, I've been charitable up to this point. Now I'm going to be very, very uncharitable. The scariest thing to conservatives is the history of oppression against black people in America coming to light, and no longer being able to deny the need for restorative justice and reparations. They benefit from the current power structure built around white supremacy. The scariest thing to me is how white people act on the anger and fear that has been planted in them by these conservative grifters. Except that my fear is actually based in reality. Impressionable young adults consume enough content demonizing and scapegoating immigrants and Muslims, and next thing you know, they are taking to the streets with a rifle to solve the problem. Others tell white people that the Jews are a threat to their future, so they take a rifle and walk into a synagogue. A religious nut job is angry at the government, so he takes his rage out on a government office full of civilian workers and children. And if you go back to the civil rights movement, examples of white rage abound. I remind you that this much anger and vitriol was just over a girl trying to go to school. We had to send in the army to walk children into school. We needed federal troops to protect black students from white rage. Black people in the South were made to be afraid of going to church, afraid that an angry white man would blow it up while they were in it. And it's easy for a lot of people to dismiss all of this as if it was that long ago, even though my parents were alive for it and remembered it very well. Which is fine. I don't need to point to events that long ago to make my point. In 2015, Dylan Roof walked into an African Methodist church and gunned down 9 people, including a pastor and a state senator. He was an angry little white boy who felt that his anger justified him killing a bunch of people. In 2019, another angry white boy under the age of 30 walked into a Walmart in El Paso with a gun and killed 23 people. How did we get to the point in this country where angry white men feel justified in doing this sort of thing? Or this. Or this. White nationalist terrorists are now more dangerous than any other terror group. They certainly have been stacking up one heck of a body count. So yeah, I think that white rage is something we should definitely be learning about. And this aggressive pushback against CRT and rampant mischaracterization of the field of study is just another form of the white rage that erupts whenever their power is challenged. And so, my hypothetical conservative white viewer, assuming you've stuck with me for this long, I need you to know, critical race theory is not your enemy. Black people are not your enemy. I am not your enemy. The people screwing up your life are the same people who want you to be afraid of CRT. And their continued power within the establishment hinges on you not knowing that. Fight the real enemy. You don't need to be afraid of the truth. Thanks for watching.